Both myself and a few others have been waiting for a while for me to get into this one. My first experience with this story came back in July of 2012 when I was beginning to fully immerse myself in the Brony fandom as more than just being a casual viewer who lurks on Memebase. At the time, I chose to experience this story via Mike the Microphone's reading. That was a mistake on my part. I'll get into exactly why in a little while, but if you're not careful, this story has a way of getting inside your heart and tearing it in half. My timing was especially terrible as I first listened to this story shortly after some of my own personal tragedy had struck. Even though I haven't recovered much since that, at least this time I'm prepared to examine My Little Dashie on its own merits as a story. If you have not done so already, I highly recommend viewing my video on what makes a good story that'll be linked in the description. This way, you'll understand exactly what I'm looking for. Now then, covering those points in no particular order and with minimal spoilers, let's dive into My Little Dashie by Rob Cachren 53. There's not much to go on in terms of characterization. Because each conflict is resolved too quickly and because the biggest conflicts are very similar in nature, we don't get to have a wide variety of situations to see these characters interact with each other and their surroundings in different ways. Rainbow Dash sort of feels like her canon counterpart, and I'm not sure whether or not I like that aspect of the story. Rainbow Dash in the canon would be a product of her surroundings from being pushed to a competitive nature by flight school and her admiration of the Wonderbolts. So this raises the question of whether or not Rainbow Dash, growing up from childhood in a completely different environment, would turn out the same. It's a tough question to answer, but ultimately, I don't think so. She doesn't have much social interaction outside the story's main character, so she'd have very little motivation to be competitive with nobody to compete against and nothing to win. The human main character is realistic enough. His reactions in the story are very typical responses that most people would have if put in the same types of situations. However, he comes off as a bit foolish at times, especially during the final conflict when he states that he should have known these situations were coming but never adequately prepared for them. However, there's very little to gauge here as well. The main character doesn't even have a name, so on one hand, it gives the reader a chance to project themselves into the story, intentionally or otherwise. However, this leaves the story with the same problem as any second-person story, which is one of the very few literary concepts that I don't like as a concept. This problem being that the moment that the character does something that you wouldn't do, even though it's supposed to be you in the story, or even worse, if you don't fall for this type of narrative in the first place, then the whole thing either has no effect on you or takes you out of the story entirely. This is why it's always better to give your character an actual character. In each segment of the story, we're treated with a very similar sequence of events. This ranges from the introduction to the various conflicts, to a fairly melodramatic reaction, and to a relatively peaceful solution. Thus, none of the characters are arced very well at all, and the development is poor if there was any to begin with. The story follows a 16-year-long period between the time of finding Rainbow Dash at the side of the road and the story's conclusion. It's mostly attempting to play on the audience's heartstrings by highlighting the serious conflicts in the life of the unnamed character and Rainbow Dash. However, it only ever touches on each of these events from beginning to end. The story only being approximately 13,000 words, there is not nearly enough space to really explore each of these situations. It makes everything feel a little rushed, and often I'm left wondering what became of the issues. Granted, on their surface they seem resolved, but these are not the types of problems that are talked about once or twice and then never thought of again. The issues that are brought up in this story are things that would be persistent, especially while raising a young girl by yourself. Though there is conflict, it is always brief and seemingly resolved quickly. If anything, there's too much conflict and not enough focus on the implications of each one. Though there are two conflicts that in particular could feel central and treated as the real story outside of the others, the character only states that he knew these situations might come but never adequately prepared for them. If anything, there are dozens of potential conflicts that were completely missed, such as Rainbow Dash's social life or lack thereof while spending so much time on Earth. There was also the completely missed opportunity of exploring the challenges that come with raising a young girl and all which that implies. The story's style is blocky and very telling. This may be slightly forgiven by the fact that it's told in first person, as this gives it a feeling of being narrated by the main character's thoughts as they happen. Though this is how many people would speak in real life if they had to narrate their own actions, it doesn't change the fact that this is not a very immersive style. The lack of real description and metaphor makes it difficult to visualize the action as it's supposed to be happening. It also means that we can only go as deep as knowing and understanding how the character feels as he goes through the motions. We don't ever really feel them with him. It's possible that the intended effect here was to create an ambiguity. Readers would go through and fill in the gaps of characterizations and descriptions by picturing themselves in the situation to some degree, or perhaps even just reminding themselves of similar situations within their own lives. I'd even go as far to say that if that is the case, it worked on a lot of people. I've lost count of possibly hundreds of comments I've seen expressing reactions to that effect. Heck, when I had my guard down, it even worked on me a little. So when I got to thinking as to why this happens, that was the most suitable explanation I could come up with. However, if this is the case, this strategy can only work on so many people. Where I've seen many comments expressing that effect, I've also seen a couple of dozen saying that the story was bland and boring. I'd venture to guess that these were the readers who had properly prepared themselves going into it and were not caught off guard by the ambiguity of the style and descriptions, or they simply couldn't relate to what was happening in the narrative and thus had nothing to pull from. But of course, I'm interested in hearing your opinions and theories on this as well. Though largely correct from a grammatical standpoint, barring a few missed commas or apostrophes, Rob Cochran 53 hits a pitfall early on by not separating dialogue properly. In fact, he separates them a bit too much. Where you're normally supposed to start a new paragraph and indent while switching between conversing characters, Rob puts a double paragraph break in between each line of dialogue, followed by his vague descriptions in another double paragraph break. This caused me to go back a few times and reread because I wasn't certain who was talking. The best example of this is early on when he first attempts to talk to Dashie. Hi there. Break. I speak, but she doesn't respond. Break. What are you doing out here? Break. Done properly, that whole segment would have been done in one paragraph. This type of thing is common to fanfictions in general, and it always drives me nuts. Another huge mistake is Rainbow Dash's letter at the end. If I hadn't known this story ahead of time, it would have taken me a bit of effort to realize that I was reading a letter and not the narrative. This is why it's important to italicize things like internal monologues and in-universe writing. Overall, this story lacks in many aspects that would make it a good story, but mostly just in the way of detail and not so much the execution. There are characters, but we don't see very much of them. There are conflicts, but they don't really lead to anything. There is an overall story, albeit far too brief to sufficiently tackle any of the gigantic slice-of-life issues that it brings up. I'm actually not certain if I can recommend this story. I suppose I can if you're the type of person that's into this first-person or semi-second-person style of narrative. I suppose I could recommend it if you're into sad fictions. I could definitely recommend it if you're usually the type that's satisfied with just the bare bones of what makes a story. It definitely works to remind us of any time that we have experienced loneliness, found hope, or suffered deep interpersonal loss. From those ambiguous emotional connections, it invokes those feelings as it was meant to invoke since it was spoken in the narrative that these characters were feeling them too. In that aspect alone, the story does its job. There are many fan-made sequels, threequels, side stories, and even a comic series by Waltz Brony on DeviantArt, all of which have been done in a very similar style of narrative and worth checking out if you liked My Little Dashie. Some of these even give the main character a name and personality. However, if you need real details and to dive deep into each character and situation, so much so that you come out of the story feeling like you've actually lived through it as one of the characters, then this story will fall very short and most of the others that branch off of it won't be much better. As always, be sure to let me know what you think. If you have a topic you would like to hear discussed, or if you have an episode, fanfiction, product, or anything else you would like to hear reviewed, send me a YouTube message or leave a comment below. You can also drop comments, questions, topic suggestions, and review suggestions by liking Brony Debates on Facebook, following on Twitter, or sending an email to bronydebates@yahoo.com. Have a great day, and I look forward to hearing from all of you soon.